Act be considered expired and the motion to proceed be agreed to. That the only amendments in order be the following: Kennedy, number 1401, Rubio, number 1405. Further, that it be in order for Senator Paul or his designee to raise a Budget Act point of order. Finally, that at 11 a.m. tomorrow, the Senate vote in relation to the amendments in the order listed and on the motion to waive, if made. That if the motion to waive is agreed to, the bill be considered read a third time, and the Senate vote on passage of the bill as amended, if amended, with 60 affirmative votes required for passage, all with no intervening action or debate.
Is there objection? Without objection, so ordered.
Mr. President, I would I would make another request. I have 14 requests for committees to meet during today's session of the Senate. They have the approval of the majority and minority leaders.
Duly noted.
Mr. President.
Senator from Colorado.
It is hard to believe that I'm on this floor again after losing 10 more people, this time in Boulder, Colorado, to another horrible mass shooting in our state. I'm sure the presiding officer doesn't remember that last week, after the events in Atlanta, I came over to your desk and I said that we were so sorry in Colorado for what had happened in Atlanta, and then just 3 or 4 days later, it happened again in Colorado. And I've spent the past day learning about the victims of this terrible crime, and I want America to know what extraordinary human beings we've lost in my state. Here they are, Mr. President. Denny Stong, age 20. Denny was a graduate of Fairview High School, an introverted, smart kid who loved history and model airplanes. He'd been covering shifts at the King Super and took enormous pride in his role as an essential worker during this pandemic. He once posted on Facebook, "I can't stay home. I'm a grocery store worker." Nevin Stenisik, age 23. Nevin's dad said he was a really good boy, good kid, a hardworking boy. His parents are refugees from Bosnia who left in the 1990s to escape the war. The reverend at their local church said his family fled the war and everything they had was either left behind or destroyed. They left everything to save their lives and came here to have a new start, said the pastor. They came to America to have a new start, only to have their son's life ended by this senseless act of violence. Ricky Olds, Mr. President, was 25 years old. Ricky had been working as a manager at King Soopers for 6 years. Her family described her as a firecracker who lit up a room with her infectious giggle. Her Aunt Lori said she had a beautiful way of just being her. When you're down, she just wanted to cheer you up just by being around. Trelana Bartkowiak, age 49. She co-owned a clothing and accessories store, Unbeloved, with her sister and was a frequent presence in the Boulder arts and music scene. She had a deep curiosity about the world that took her on travels from Nepal to Costa Rica. Her younger brother remembers her as a beam of light. Tori Liker, age 51. She was a huge fan of the Buffaloes at CU, a regular face at the Pearl Street Stampede. A friend called Terry the most selfless, innocent, amazing person I have had the honor of meeting. Suzanne Fountain, 59 years old. She worked for 15 years in the Boulder Community Hospital. She loved gardening and was passionate about music and theater. A friend described her as the cream of the crop and a good person, a good soul. Kevin Mahoney, age 61. Kevin had worked in the hotel business but retired early to spend more time traveling, skiing, and visiting his daughter, Erica. After learning of her father's death, Erica wrote, "My dad represents all things love. I'm so thankful he could walk me down the aisle last summer." Lynn Murray, age 62. Lynn was a mother of two and a retired photo director for prominent national magazines. Her husband, John, said, "I just want her to be remembered as this amazing, amazing comet, spending 62 years flying across the sky." Jody Waters, 65 years old. Jody used to own a boutique clothing store named Applause on Pearl Street Mall, where she remembered all her customers and their favorite brands. She was a mother of two and a grandmother who loved horses and hiking. A friend said when Jody walked into the room, she was a breath of fresh air, a light. Finally, Officer Eric Talley. He's 51 years old. He's a man of deep faith and a devoted father of 7. After losing a close friend to a DUI, he joined the police academy at age 40, just 11 years ago, to give back to the community. In 2013, he made headlines when he helped rescue 11 ducklings from a drainage ditch. Eric's father said he loved his kids and family more than anything. For their sake, he was hoping to stay off the front lines by learning to become a drone operator. But when the bullets rang out, he rushed into action, first on the scene, saving countless lives at the cost of his own. Officer Talley and these other folks represent the best of Colorado. And we certainly owe Officer Talley a debt of gratitude we'll never be able to repay. Mr. President, my heart goes out to all the families and the entire community of Boulder, we have endured too many tragedies as a state. So many other states are the same here. The shootings at Columbine High School happened right before my oldest daughter was born, Caroline Bennett. She's 21 years old. And her entire generation has grown up in the shadow of gun violence. Something none of us had to do. I remember, Mr. President, after a gunman in Las Vegas took the lives of 59 Americans. That was a Monday that I came to work and realized during the course of the day that I was having meeting after meeting after meeting, and nobody was mentioning the massacre of 59 Americans. I don't know if it was 2 or 3 or 4 of these events before that we began to somehow accept this as normal. That you could lose that many people and not have a conversation about what had happened. The headlines all moving on to the next thing. And we can't allow this to become normal. And it's not just the mass shootings, it's the daily shooting the presiding officer and I talked about last week that have happened in Atlanta over the last couple of weekends, or on the west side of Chicago. So we can't move on. Boulder will heal, but this scar will always be there. My daughter's generation will always bear the burden of a national government that did nothing to protect them. They and the children that I used to work for in the Denver public schools, they carry a burden that we didn't carry. They have grown up with a reasonable fear that they will be shot in their classrooms or in their schools or at a movie theater or in any public place. I didn't grow up in an America with more gun-related deaths than virtually any country in this world, and we can't accept it for their America. I'm not asking anybody here to show the courage that Officer Talley showed, or the other men and women of law enforcement who constantly have to deal with the inability of this place's capacity to deal with these issues. I'm just asking us to show an ounce of their courage by doing whatever we can to keep weapons of war out of our communities, to pass universal background checks, to limit the size of magazines, to address the epidemic crisis of mental health in this country. It seems like that would be the least that we could do. In the wake of one of these incidents, I heard somebody say on a radio program that this was just the price of freedom. That these murders are the price of freedom. What a shame that somebody would say that and mean it. What a surrender that represents to our children and to the victims of these crimes. What a sacrifice of their right to be free from fear. Who are we to insist that they live terrified in their own country? Nobody insisted that we live that way, but our failure to act has helped create these conditions, and we can't wait any longer. The Senate needs to act. There's nobody else to act but the United States Senate. I want to end by thanking my colleagues from Connecticut, Senator Blumenthal and Senator Murphy, for their incredible, steadfast leadership for long before they came to the Senate. But I remember as one of the darkest moments of my Senate career, the votes that we took after Newtown, when that elementary school, Sandy Hook, was shot up. 20 students were killed. And this Senate couldn't even pass universal background checks. And they're here tonight to continue to make the case that we need to act, and I want to again thank them for their resilience and for caring about the people that lived and died in Colorado. I'm extremely grateful for their example. Thank you, Mr. President. I yield the floor.
Mr. President.
Senator from Connecticut.
Thank you, Mr. President. I thank my friend, Senator Bennett, for those remarks, for honoring the memories of those that we have lost and commanding us to action. I remember getting a phone call from Michael Bennett that Friday morning as Senator Blumenthal and I were sitting in a firehouse in Sandy Hook, Connecticut, learning what had happened just around the corner at a schoolhouse. I remember getting advice from Michael Bennett about what you do if you're an elected official in the midst of this tragedy, because he had already been through it once before. Colorado had already been through it more than once before. And I think about this macabre club that an increasing number of members of the Senate and House belong to, in which we have this memory bank of what to do when a mass shooting happens in your district or your state, a set of capacities that no member of the House or Senate, no governor ever had to think about or ever consider possessing decades ago. And now we call each other when these things happen to impart advice as to how to be helpful to communities that are grieving. I'm thankful to have friends like Senator Bennett who can be with others at moments like this, but I hate the fact that he knows all too well what communities go through when something happens like happened earlier this week in Boulder. Mr. President, we thought about what to do to try to move this country and our colleagues to action after another spate of mass shootings. This is a really old chart that I've brought down to the floor for years. These numbers are out of date, unfortunately, because, well, in 2019, we were losing 100 people a day to gun violence. That's not the number from 2020 or 2021. We've seen a dramatic increase in gun violence. And well, in 2020, we didn't see the mass shootings that we had been accustomed to in years prior. We have now seen them once again pop up on our TV screens in 2021. But the lack of mass shooting masked the reality, which was a dramatic increase in the number of people who were felled by guns over the course of last year. And so we thought about what we could do to try to make more real for our colleagues the scope of this epidemic. And we thought of maybe something simple, to make people understand that these aren't really numbers, right? The numbers are just a way to explain in aggregate who these people are, because each one of them is an individual. Each one of them led a life. Each one of them had people who loved them. Each one of them loved people. So many of them, you can just see by these snapshots, were young. They had full lives ahead of them, businesses to start, families to begin. None of that happened for them because they were shot often at the beginning or the peak of their early life. And so tonight, I'm hopeful that I'll be joined by a number of my colleagues to do something simple, just to read into the record, the permanent congressional record, the names of those that have died just in 2021. Every single day, there's over 100 people dying right now. I don't think America has ever seen this rate of gun violence, with the exception of wartime in our history. And while we won't have time to tell you the story of all of these people, as Michael did, about those who were lost in Boulder, at least we can make sure that forever their name and a link to their story is in the congressional record. Senator Bennett already talked about Lynn Murray and Suzanne Fountain, Terry Leiker, Kevin Mahoney, Treylana Bartkowiak, Ricky Olds, Nevin Stenisik, Denny Strong, Jody Waters, Eric Talley. Those are the victims from Colorado, and I'm sorry if I didn't get the pronunciations perfectly. But we also lost, over the course of the first 3 months of this year, Patrice Lynette Jones in Indiana, Kelvin Darnell from Illinois, Kayvon Dickerson from Kentucky, Leah Brooke Hines from Ohio, Linda McMurray in Tennessee, Michael Utley in Missouri, Jade Gardner in Pennsylvania, Robert Randall Turner III from Maryland, Maddox Jones in Georgia, Joseph Jackson in Florida. On Monday, same day as the shooting in Boulder, Alicia Mosquito, 28 years old, was shot and killed in New Haven, Connecticut, with her 1-year-old daughter sitting in the back seat of her car. She and her boyfriend were arguing in the car when he shot her to death. According to her mother, Alicia had been trying to leave her boyfriend. Alicia is described as a devoted mother who loved her children with all her heart. Many of her friends really relied on her for advice and guidance. They said she'd give the shirt off her back to help a friend. Her mom said, quote, "My heart has been shattered, and I don't think I'm ever going to be right again." She was the second of 8 children. She had 2 children of her own, and her mother will now raise her 2 grandchildren. Nobody heard about Alicia Mosquito being shot with her daughter in the back seat in New Haven, Connecticut on Monday. Her life isn't any less valuable than any of those that were killed in mass shootings, but this country's attention to the pandemic of gun violence, the epidemic of gun violence, it seems to only surface when there is a mass shooting. Benjamin Bagley was shot last week in Bridgeport, Connecticut. He was 22 years old. He was remembered by friends and family as somebody who always kept a smile on the faces of people who loved him. He was a doting father. He was a loving son, and brother who always made people smile. He was taken from us far before his light was fully able to shine its brightest, his friends wrote. He was one of 6 siblings, 2 brothers and 4 sisters. He had 2 children and 1 on the way. He was born and raised in Bridgeport. He was involved in his church. His mom, Michelle Brown, said, "I had to kiss my son lying in a hospital bed, dead. I don't wish this on nobody, not even my worst enemy." This wasn't the first time Benjamin had been shot. He had been previously wounded in a shooting in 2016, but he had recovered. Kevin Zhang was 26 years old. About a month and a half ago, in early February, he was killed by gun violence. He had moved to New Haven just 2 years ago to pursue a master's degree at the Yale School of the Environment. He was a West Coast native. He'd gotten engaged 1 week before his death. He had earned a degree. He was an Army veteran. He was a present Army National Guard member. He was shot outside his fiancee's apartment. His fiancée said, "Kevin was a gift from God. He was a true and righteous man after God's own heart. Life is so precious and short. My only hope is that he is with his heavenly Father now in perfect peace." An extraordinary young man, said Yale University's president. I mean, Mr. President, I've got a stack of names, 2025 per page. We don't have enough time tonight to just read into the record the number of the victims of gun violence in 2021 alone. Adam Todd Saeed in South Carolina. Andrew Wesley from Ohio. Antonio Robon Thompson from South Carolina. Atrell Connor, Louisiana. Bo Michael Wasmer in West Virginia. Brittany Wagoner Moore in Ohio. Byron Donnell Ross in Texas. Carolyn Ann Stevenson, North Carolina. Christian Parra, New Jersey. Christopher Bess, Illinois. David Caballero, California. David Prince, Illinois. Dean Wagstaff, Washington. Devin Dawkins, Missouri. Dolores Reyes, California. Eric Thompson, Tennessee. Gloria Dean, Eddington Lewis, Ohio. Harold Edward Dennison, West Virginia. Javante Hendricks, Illinois. Jeffrey Gillespie, Mississippi. Justin Bartley Williams, Texas. Ken Keldrick Love, Louisiana. Kyron Golden, Alabama. LaShawn Long, Illinois. Malcolm Fitz, Illinois. Marcel Tremont Pimpton, Texas. Mario Vines, Oklahoma. Melissa Marie Neese, Florida. Nestor Gregario, Texas. Pedro Arturo Delgado, Tagle, Texas. Rene Hernandez, Texas. Robert Trey Scott III, Indiana. Ryan Abraham Wittes, Sachs, Minnesota. Satnam Singh, Utah. Shamso Getty Abdi, Minnesota. Teresa Ratliff, Ohio. Thomas T.J. Carr, Ohio. Timothy Alfred Nelson, Texas. Timothy Duggar, Ohio. Tony Nichols, Missouri. Trayvon D. Buckner. Victor Zuniga. Xavier Crosby. Adam David Lawrence. Arim Binde. Bobby King. Brandon Chunko. Carol Tinsley. Cecilia Apollo. Christian Joseph Jones. Christopher Benton McLeod. Corey McHaffey. Curtis Lee Upshaw. DeAndre Carter, Domenico Howell, Danelle Hoskin, Grayson Babs, Jamie Ball. It's 2 pages. I got 20 more here. My colleagues will hopefully join me on the floor tonight to read some of these names into the record. This is as astonishing as it is heartbreaking that this country allows for this to happen, allows for these individuals to effectively be nameless, to be anonymous. Tonight, we're only reading into the record the names of individuals who died in this year, and this year isn't even 90 days old. How is it that we pay attention during the mass shootings, but just sleep through the days in which all of these people are stolen from us through an epidemic that is preventable? This doesn't happen anywhere else in the high-income world. No other nation permits this level of gun violence. Don't tell me it's the price of admission to America. Don't tell me it's not preventable. Don't tell me it's inevitable. It only happens here. It only happens here. And it's really hard to comprehend the impact that this has on people. I was in an elementary school in Baltimore, Maryland, about 2 years ago. I'd gone there to see an after-school program that I had heard was very successful. School had started about an hour late that day because of a weather delay. And so when I was inside the school at about 10 o'clock, kids were still just arriving. And I went upstairs to join the young lady who ran this program. And we were about a half an hour into our conversation when buzzers started going off and the lights flickered and the intercom system lit up with somebody from the central office repeating over and over again, "Code green, code green, code green, code green." I didn't know what code green was. The person I was meeting with, who was just running this after-school program, didn't know what code green was. Luckily, the front office called up and told us that code green means there's been an active shooting somewhere in and around the school, and that everybody needs to turn the lights off, lock the doors, shut the blinds. And so that's what we did. It was 10:30 in the morning. After about 20 minutes, the code green ended. The lights turned back on. We continued our discussion. I was shaken. This is a school I'd never set foot in. I'd only been there for about 20 minutes, and there was an active shooting within a handful of blocks. And so I wanted to know what happened. I stayed in touch with personnel at the school. I read the Baltimore papers over the course of the next few days to find out what had happened. And here's what I found out. A young man by the name of Corey Dodds, who lived just down the street from the school, had told his wife, I believe her name is Marissa, if I remember correctly, that he dropped their twins off at Matthew Henson Elementary School that morning. They had 2 other kids. She was busy with them. He said, "I'll drop the kids off this morning." And so he drove the kids to Matthew Henson Elementary School, the twin girls, brought them into the building. I could have been in that lobby with him that morning as I was coming in and he was leaving. He got into his car, he drove a few blocks home, and in between his car and the door, he was shot dead at 10 o'clock in the morning. His little girl, the youngest, always waited for him at the door when he was arriving. Well, he never showed up to that door because he died that day. And these 2 little twin girls in that school at the same time that I was, who might have been giggling as they took a break from instruction and the lights went off, and they got to chat with their friends, didn't know that they were never going to see their father again. Think about how the lives of those children change when your dad vanishes from the earth just like that. Think about how the lives of all the children in that school change when they have to contemplate the fact that their dads might not be home when they arrive next week or the week after, if it could happen to Mr. Dodds. Think about how the entire neighborhood goes through trauma after trauma when that happens so routinely in a place like Baltimore. You can't understand the scope of this epidemic by just reading off these names. Adam Todd Saeed died. Jason Wilson died. Jath Burns died. John Jero Brito died. Johnny Clark died. Jonathan Joseph died. Jose Madero died. Joseph Carney died. Justin Locklear died. Justin Marshall died of gun violence. So did Kristen Slack and Larturis Harris and Lieutenant Justin Bedwell. They all died of gunshot wounds just in 2021, but they simply represent the surface. You scratch just a bit, and you will find their kids and their moms and their dads and their neighbors who are going through trauma right now because of their death. Research tells us that often there are 20 people who experience a definable trauma when someone close to them dies. And so even the names that we read into the record tonight don't accurately represent the scope of this trauma. Those kids' lives will never, ever be the same in Sandtown, the neighborhood of Baltimore in which this elementary school sits. Neither will be the lives of those kids who go to that school. And maybe what was so inexplicable to me was that I had to work really hard to find out anything about that young man. It was barely a story the next day that he had died, bringing his daughters to school and then returning home. Had there been 6 more people shot, maybe it would have made the papers, maybe America would have paid attention. But think of it this way. What if that same story played out, not in Baltimore, Maryland, with an African-American father and African-American girls? What if that story played out in Westport, Connecticut, with a white father and 2 twin blonde-haired white girls? Do we care less because Corey was African-American? You better believe it. You better believe that headline news would have been running stories about an affluent white suburban father dropping his kids off at an affluent white suburban school and being shot before he entered his suburban home. We don't care about individual loss of life like we care about the victims of mass shooting. That's a tragedy. But we also don't care about the loss of black life. We don't care about the people of color who die in the same way that we care when white people die in this country. That's just the truth. So tonight, my colleagues and I are going to come to the floor, and I hope some will join me. I thank Senator Blumenthal for being here to start us off. To read into the record the names of individuals who have been lost to gun violence in 2021 as a way to make sure we recognize who they are and the lives that they led, but also as a last gasp effort to try to convince our colleagues to do something. Tonight isn't really going to be the night to go deep into policy. Senator Bennett talked about what we know we need to do. We can have that debate at another time. Tonight's a night to just recognize the scope of this epidemic. How many people are being lost? How many lives are being impacted in mass shootings and in individual acts of violence, in homicides and suicides and domestic violence incidences? And maybe by pounding into people's brains the human toll of this tragedy in mass shootings and in other forums, we can inch this body a little bit closer to doing the right thing. I yield the floor.
Mr. President,
Senator from Connecticut.
I'm honored to follow my colleagues, Senator Murphy and Bennett, 2 fellow champions of this cause. Again, we have stood here so many times to advocate for measures that very simply would make Americans safer. And I don't accept that it will be our last gasp. I don't accept that we will ever go away, that we will ever abandon this cause, no matter how long and how hard it is. Senator Murphy and I were in Sandy Hook the afternoon of that massacre. We lived through an excruciatingly heartbreaking, gut-wrenching, stunning experience, but nothing compared to the children who were taken out of the school, nothing compared to the teachers who shepherded them, nothing compared to anyone who lived through it, or the emergency responders who had to see the scene of carnage that day. And of course, nothing approaching the trauma of parents and loved ones. So our club, as he called it, is one that pales in significance to the club of survivors and victims. It is more than the names we read tonight. It is the children who take cover when that code is rung. It is the teachers who suffer the apprehension of wondering whether that day will be the one when there is a shooter. It is the parents of all children who send their kids to school and wonder whether at the end of the day they will see them again. At some level, maybe not all, maybe not always, not every day, but that fear in the gut, that powerfully important apprehension is there for many. When I was in elementary school, the fear was of nuclear annihilation. And the drills we did were to dive beneath our desks as though somehow those desks could be protected in the midst of a nuclear attack. Absurd as it seems looking back, every one of us during those years wondered, would that be the day? And on the days before the Cuban Missile Crisis, it became more real than ever. And for that generation, it was the fear. For this generation, gun violence is the fear that lurks constantly in the heart, in the back of the mind, and always a presence. The names that we're going to read tonight are a very partial list of the injuries, because we're reading the ones who died, but many others were injured severely and horrifically. Bones shattered, flesh torn, futures changed forever. And of course, the emotional trauma of living through it. But we have to read these names because it is part of our responsibility to make them real and to remind ourselves, as much as anyone, that this issue is a matter of life and death in a way that few others that we debate in this chamber evoke. At the beginning of the Judiciary Committee hearing the other day, just this week, we had a moment of silence. But we cannot be silent. Yes, we will offer thoughts and prayers, but we cannot be silent, and we must do more than speak. We must act. Honor with action. We cannot let these brave, wonderful souls go gently into this good night. We must rage against the dying of the light. And that is what we're doing by reading these names, reminding ourselves that we cannot accept these deaths as a normal. Even with the pandemic receding, we hope, the epidemic of gun violence continues. And A gun, a firearm, especially an assault weapon, makes fatal and irreversible some of the most serious problems. Whether it's domestic violence, suicide, or simply a profoundly disturbed young man walking into a grocery store, or a racist and misogynist man going into a spa. The involvement of guns and firearms makes those incidents deadly. And the names that I will read will be of all ethnicities and religions and backgrounds and races, because firearms can be an equal opportunity killer. But Senator Murphy is right that communities of color suffer disproportionately. And in Atlanta, who can doubt that a hate crime turned deadly, potentially because of that gun? Dominic Boston, Brad Keel, Ildiko Pap, James Ray Huddleston, Glenda Swan Toms, Kayla Marie Keats, Ethan Delicat, Paula Marie Booth, Raymond Robinson, Delana Ashley Yon, Hyun Gung Grant, Doyu Fung, Tosan Jung Park, Soon Cho Kim, Chio Gi Tan, Young L. Yu, Paul Avindray Michaels. Last week, 8 lives were taken by gun violence, and they should be remembered and their lives recounted. Delana Ashley Yon was a 33-year-old newlywed and mother of 2, including a daughter she gave birth to this summer. She put her family above all else and cared for family members and friends who needed help or a place to stay during tough times. Her manager said, quote, "Her heart was so big, she loved people," end quote. He describes how she would feed diners at the restaurant where she worked who were homeless and bring them home to offer them showers and clean clothes. One friend described Delana as a, quote, light. She just made everybody happy. She loves to smile and joke and hang out with her kids and make sure they always had fun. She was a happy person. Hyun Chung Grant was 51 years old. She worked as a school teacher in South Korea before immigrating to the United States. She was a hardworking and loving single mother of 2 who loved karaoke, dancing, and electronic music, and made the world's best kimchi stew. One of her sons, Randy, wrote, "She was a single mother who dedicated her whole life to providing for my brother and I. It is only my brother and I in the United States. She was one of my best friends and the strongest influence on who we are today." Diu Feng was 44 years old. What we know about her from her friends is that she was sweet and kind. That's how she was described by her coworkers as well. Soon Chung Park was an active 74-year-old mother and mother-in-law. She lived in Atlanta. She moved there several years ago to be closer to friends, and she was well on her way to living past 100 Because of the pandemic, she missed chances to visit her family in the Northeast, but was planning to move back this summer to be closer to relatives and friends. Her son-in-law described that Soon, quote, just liked to work. It wasn't for the money. She wanted a little bit of work for her life. Soon-Chik Kim, 69 years old. She was married for more than 50 years, and she was a fighter and a rock for her 2 children and 3 grandchildren. She was a hard worker and enjoyed line dancing. Soon-Chik came to the United States around 1980. She spoke little English and worked 2 to 3 jobs, putting her children first and always seeking to help others. She volunteered by cooking and fundraising. One of her grandchildren wrote, "My grandmother was an angel. As an immigrant, all my grandmother ever wanted in life was to grow old with my grandfather and watch her children and grandchildren live the life she never got to live." Ji Chao-gi, too, killed that day before her 50th birthday. She was a dedicated wife, mother, friend. She was devoted to her job and dedicated to her fellow employees. Her husband said that, quote, she donated and gave money to her employees and treated them so well. She was always celebrating their birthdays, doing good things for them. End of quote. She was curious, hardworking, and caring, always filled with joy. She worked long hours every day to give her family a better life. Her daughter said that Chiao was her best friend and that she, quote, did everything for me and the family. She provided everything, end quote. Young A.U., 63 years old. She was an amazing mother of 2 sons and loved to cook Korean food. She came to the United States in the 1970s, and after being laid off during the pandemic, she was excited to be back at work. She enjoyed visiting friends, watching movies and soap operas and reading. She always loved to read and have her dog at her side. Paul Andre Michaels. He was a 54-year-old Army veteran, one of 9 children, and he'd been married for more than 20 years. He loved to fish and collect rare coins. He treated everyone like he was their uncle, did what he could to help others. One friend said of Paul that, quote, he would give you the shirt off his back. His younger brother John said, he'd loan you money if you needed it sometimes. You never went away from his place hungry. My home state of Connecticut is not immune to gun violence. Sandy Hook is the best known of the tragedies, but there are others, many, many, many others. All around the state, in big cities, in small towns, in rural areas, and suburban, nobody is immune. Nobody is protected against gun violence, so long as the pipeline, the iron pipeline, even with Connecticut's strong laws, draws guns across state borders. Here are some of the names and stories of people whose lives have been taken in Connecticut. Jaquan Walters was killed on September 19, 2020 in Hartford. He was 24 years old. His mother, Trishan, writes, and I quote, there was an altercation with someone inside a store. The fight was broken up, but the other young man still shot him and then stood over him a second time. Shot him again. Jaquan was a college graduate. He was known as a big basketball player for Albertus Magnus. He played overseas for 2 seasons before COVID hit. My son saw a lot of gun violence growing up in the city, and he became victim to it, even though he tried his best to beat all the odds with a bachelor degree in communication. He even played in Argentina as a professional basketball player, mentored kids through basketball. He got a proclamation from his work at the Parker Memorial Center and the village where he worked with troubled kids. End of quote. Jaquan's coach at Albertus Magnus described him as, quote, the kind of kid who got along with everyone. His likability crossed every age generation. When I ran a camp, 18-year-old kids, instantly, he was the guy. They'd all gravitate toward him. Same thing with our team. They loved him. Opponents loved him. I've gotten a lot of texts. And I got one from a Northeast coach who said he had that thing. He had that thing where he'd drop 30 points on you, and every opponent not only respected him, but genuinely liked him. Another coach said Jaquan was very, very rooted in the Hartford community. And he loved his town. So he was always going to be one of those people that came back and gave as much as he was able. Another said, another coach, he had such a great impact. The guy had so much more to give. That is the story of every one of these victims. So much more to give. So much more to give back, whether to Hartford or sons and daughters or parents. Ethan Song was killed in Guilford on January 31, 2018, 12 days after his 15th birthday, with an unsecured firearm in his neighbor's house. He lived a life with laughter, adventure, and passion. He lived with adoring family members, Kristen and Michael Song. Ethan loved to ski and hike and play spike ball too. He helped his mom, Kristen, in finding homes for abandoned puppies. Ethan loved food. He and his dad, Mike, ventured to find the best lobster roll in New England. They sampled 15 locations. He loved lacrosse, and he was good at it, making the all-star team one season. He was always interested in his family's history. He tried to learn all that he could about his grandmother's experience as a Holocaust survivor, and went so far as to divert a family trip to the UK to see the Anne Frank house in the Netherlands. Ethan was also fascinated by his grandfather's experience as a decorated intelligence officer in the Korean War. I'm always so inspired by Kristen and Michael Song and Ethan's sister, their strength and courage, their joy in life, and their unquenchable loyalty and love for Ethan. I've stood on the green in Guilford announcing my introduction of Ethan's Law, a safe storage law that they have championed with grace and dignity and power beyond words. And let's say it out loud. This gun violence is every parent's worst nightmare. Every parent's worst fear. Going to school, going to a neighbor's house, going to a grocery store. Wrong place at the wrong time. A neighbor's house where a firearm was unsafely stored. Watching the emergency response team pull to that neighbor's house and knowing something is terribly, terribly wrong. Every parent's worst nightmare. And Lori Jackson's parents know very graphically about that nightmare because their daughter, Lori Jackson, of Oxford, Connecticut, came to their house seeking refuge from an estranged husband. And that night, while her infant children slept, Lori Jackson was gunned down by that husband, who was under a protective order, which should have barred his having a firearm. But at that point, Connecticut law applied only to permanent protective orders. She was killed by that man, even though he was under a protective order. She was 32 years old. She was a loving daughter and a mother of twins, and her mother also was severely injured. And her parents, with that same grace and dignity and strength and courage, have championed protection for domestic violence victims and survivors. She had so much to give, like Ethan, like so many others. And we remember Noah, Charlotte, Jack, Olivia, Dylan, Catherine, Aviel, Jessica, James, Josephine, Caroline, Benjamin, Chase, Anna, Grace, Emily, Madeline, Allison, Daniel, Jesse. 20 beautiful, innocent children taken at Sandy Hook Elementary School in Newtown. More than 8 years ago, we remember them for bringing bursts of light and laughter into the lives of their family and friends, for bringing love into the lives of all who knew them, and for their joy and boundless energy. Only 6 years old, but they had so much to give, and their lives cut short at Sandy Hook that day. And we remember the heroism of those brave, courageous educators that December morning. Victoria, Lauren, Anne-Marie, Rachel, Mary, and Dawn. We remember their courage, some of them physically shielding students with their own bodies, running unhesitatingly toward danger, barricading classrooms, drawing on all their reserves of calm and professionalism to protect and shield the children in their care. We read these names, I feel, almost as a form of prayer. We cannot save any of these victims, but we know we can save others. And that is our work. As John F. Kennedy said in his inaugural speech, Here on earth, God's work must truly be our own. Thank you, Mr. President. I yield the floor.
Mr. President.
Senator from Nevada.
Thank you. I rise today to join my colleagues. And I know, at this juncture, it is hard to find the words. How many more shootings, how many more individuals have to die before we take action? And I rise because my senator colleague, the great senator from Connecticut, identifying these names as a form of prayer, which I could not have said that better, because this is about recognizing those we've lost in order to prevent future loss of life. So I join them to recognize individuals across the country and in my home state of Nevada who have lost their lives. Vincent Brown of Colorado, Zamir Bell of New Jersey, Anthony Stanley of Missouri, Bao Yang, Minnesota, Daisy Navarrete from Texas, David Camacho, Rhode Island, Deontay Minor, Washington, D.C., Ronald B. Williams from Indiana. All of these individuals were killed by gun violence. And just those names would be too many, yet they represent a few in a heartbreakingly long list of victims, families, and communities whose lives have been ripped apart by senseless gun violence just this year. Sadly, my home state of Nevada has been no stranger to this pain. In Las Vegas on October 1st, 2017, a gunman opened fire on a crowd of thousands of people at the Route 91 Harvest Music Festival. He killed 58 people that night. 2 more victims have since died from injuries they received that evening, and hundreds more were injured. People who just wanted to enjoy an evening of celebration with their friends and family. I know the fear and the trauma that so many families experienced that day. My niece was at that concert. And my family and I, we are incredibly grateful that she made it home safely. But I will never forget, on that Monday after the horrific shooting that took place, sitting at the Reconciliation Center in Las Vegas with the families, with the parents, the uncles, the aunts, the siblings, who were waiting to find out what happened to their loved one. Can you imagine? It is the most horrific thing any family member could go through. You're waiting to hear what happened to your family member, your child, your son, daughter, your niece, your nephew, your father, your mother, and you're hoping that as time and the clock ticks away, that your child is not one that is in the back room with a coroner right now. And I cannot tell you how heartbreaking it was to be with those families and talking to them. And the fear and the anxiety and the helplessness and the hope that still they clung to, that they would find out that their child or their brother or their mother or sister was really safe somewhere in one of the hospitals in Las Vegas. No one can imagine that, and no one should have to imagine that, and no one should ever have to go through that. But that's what families and loved ones have been going through over the years because of the senseless gun violence that is happening across this country. Every day, more than 100 families lose a loved one to gun violence. Austin Cooper Meyer, age 24, from Sparks, Nevada. Brennan Lee Stewart, age 30, from North Las Vegas. Cameron Lee Robinson, age 28, from Las Vegas. Charleston Hartfield, age 34, from Henderson, Nevada, a police officer. Eric Steven Silva, age 21, from Las Vegas. Laura Ann Shipp, age 50, from Las Vegas. Nisha Christina Tonks, age 46, from Las Vegas. Quentin Joe Robbins, age 20, from Henderson. Those are just 8 of the 60 Americans who lost their lives during the Root Harvest Festival in Las Vegas on October 1st. And their names and stories will stick with us forever. But we also have to remember the loved ones they've left behind. So many of these names. I know now, not just because of the horrific shooting, but because I have met their family members that they've left behind. Children that were left behind. Children that lost their parent to this horrific gunfire. Husbands and wives, mothers and fathers. It just goes on and on and on. In the next few minutes, I want to share some stories of Nevadans whose lives have been altered by gun violence. Many of these stories are heartbreaking, and they stem from the October 1 mass shooting, which took place in Las Vegas. Before I talk about them, however, I have to also recognize and praise the many heroes who stood up and worked to protect our community that night. After the bullets stopped raining down on the Las Vegas Strip, a former Marine turned a truck into a makeshift ambulance and drove more than 24 people to one of our hospitals. A couple provided CPR to injured victims on the site. And hundreds of concertgoers risked their lives carrying fellow concertgoers to safety. In fact, many younger attendees already had a sense of what to do to stop the bleeding from bullet holes and knew to run for safety in the breaks in between the sounds of gunshots because of training they had received in their schools and workplaces. But after the shooting, I received a letter from a constituent who survived the Las Vegas shooting. And she wrote, "On October 1st, 2017, our life was forever changed. My husband and I attended the Route 91 Harvest Festival. We were having the time of our lives, enjoying the different bands we got to see and singing along with all of our favorite songs. My husband and I were so moved when one of the bands led the audience singing God Bless America. Who would have known that just a few hours later, our lives would be changed forever? When the shooting started, I thought it was firecrackers. We looked around, and then there were more shots. My husband pulled me to the ground, laying on top of me, shielding me from the gunfire. He laid there tense, waiting to be shot, while I laid there waiting for him to go limp. We prayed and told each other that we loved one another. I prayed we would live to see our children raise their children, and I felt Jesus' hands covering us. During a pause in the shooting, my husband pulled me up to start running. I was terrified because we could hear bullets whizzing by and we could smell gunpowder. There were 3 people that I know of who were shot right around us. The shooting continued for what felt like forever. We continued running and ran across Las Vegas Boulevard while the shooting continued. There was so much confusion, and we didn't know if there were more shooters. By the grace of God, my husband and I are unharmed physically. Our emotional scars are still to be determined. Sleeping has been difficult. I have had periods of uncontrollable shaking. I have chronic stomach pains and have difficulty eating. All of this seems trivial compared to the families who have lost mothers, fathers, sons, and daughters, and the hundreds of people still suffering with physical injuries. Now, I read that letter because it is not just, as I've said before, about the lives that we've lost, but it's about the lives who are affected by gun violence. Reading that letter is just heartbreaking. And to think that her trauma is experienced by so many other Americans from Las Vegas, from Parkland, from Orlando, and from Boulder. It is a stain on our nation. And I have, since that shooting, been able to meet so many incredible survivors of the shooting, including 2 sisters, the Morano sisters, who were at the concert that night and are still living with the emotional scars from being there in that horrific shooting. Gina Morano has learned to prepare herself for Independence Day and New Year's Eve, when the sounds of fireworks can sound eerily similar to gunfire. But if a car backfires unexpectedly, she has to start the process of reminding herself, you're safe, it's okay, don't worry. And her sister Marisa, who was also at the festival, says her own daughter has picked up the habit of reacting to loud noises. She said, it breaks my heart because my trauma has now passed on to her. The fear resurfaces for these sisters in so many situations. On anniversaries, including of all the shootings since then, at high schools where Gina was doing outreach to students and feared that she was putting herself at risk of another shooting, passing the strip, eerily during the COVID pandemic, like it was on the day of the festival because the strip was shut down. Anywhere where there is darkness and music, even on an evening out, the sisters still feel the repercussions of that night at the concert. And they are not alone. While the tragedy of the Route 91 shooting may be 3 years behind us, for many survivors, a moment can bring it all roaring back, and many more live in fear that it could happen again. Telemachus Orphanos, a survivor of the Route 91 Harvest Festival shooting, was killed when a gunman entered the Borderline Bar and Grill and shot 12 innocent people on November 7th, 2018. What happened to Telemachus and other 1 October survivors in the restaurant that night was a uniquely American phenomenon that we should not be proud of. We keep having these mass shootings in our country, and it is past time that we act. It's not only what our nation deserves, it's what these families and these survivors and those who lost their lives deserve. The Nevadan who shared her 1 October experience with me ended her letter by stating, I am urging you to pass thoughtful, reasonable controls that will enhance the safety of our society. It is time to take action to protect our mothers, fathers, sons, daughters, nieces, nephews, cousins, and friends, please do not sit back and do nothing. And she's right. We cannot sit back and do nothing. We must pass common sense gun legislation like the universal background checks that we have passed in the state of Nevada. That will help keep Americans safe. We owe it to our friends and families and all of the victims who have already been irrevocably marked by gun violence to take action. Thank you, Mr. President.
Mr. President.
Senator from Connecticut.
Thank you, Mr. President. I thank my friend, Senator Cortez Masto, for that powerful testimony, for sharing some of these stories, for talking about the impact on families in Las Vegas and throughout her state, and to talk about what this means from a parent's perspective, to think that her own family had to wonder whether their loved one was going to come back from that shooting that dominated the news, to think about how many lives were changed. Senator Blumenthal made a really important observation earlier, and that was that the numbers we're using here, 39,000 people dying a year, the names that we're reading into the record, these are the names of the individuals who have died. But what we know is there are hundreds of thousands of others who have survived gunshot wounds. The trauma is different, but it is still serious and acute. When a loved one is shot, obviously that comes with a moral disruption to the family that's hard to calculate, and often that injury has lifelong consequences. Individuals bound to a wheelchair, losing the use of legs and arms. These are serious consequences that affect the rest of your life. And so, while today we are reading into the record the names of those who have died, this stack, which represents, I think, just a fraction of those who have died in 2021, could be 4 times as high if we had talked about those who have been injured in episodes of gun violence. Other colleagues are going to join us here tonight on the floor. But while they do, let me just read into the record a handful of additional names. Carlessa Taylor, Cleveland Sanders, Courtney Smith, Missouri, Corporal Martinus Mitchum from Louisiana, Daniel Bonham from Georgia, Daryl Merriweather from Iowa, Devon Lon Ramel from Minnesota, Deontay Petty from Kentucky, Gregory Marchand from Missouri, Gwendolyn McMillan from Georgia, Irvin Pilabla from New Mexico, Jacob Lee Haynes from Pennsylvania, Jonathan Jose Martinez, Pennsylvania, Julian Castillo, Illinois, Julie Lee Carvelis, Mississippi, Keith Hawkins, Arkansas, Lee Patrick David, West Virginia, Menyari Smith, Illinois, Mario Turner, Illinois, Marquise Jones, Louisiana, Nazir DeFares, California, Nicolette Sheridan Law, Pennsylvania, Officer Dominic Jared, Virginia, Peter Van Vallis, Montana, Quaileel Terrian Young, Texas, Raymond William Neiman, Kansas, Reginald Copning, Louisiana, Reginald James, California, Robert Bigger, Illinois. I'm sure some cynical viewer tonight may listen to a name they recognize on this list and say, oh, well, wait a second, I know that guy, he had a criminal record. That individual was involved with some bad people. There's never a justification for a gun homicide. no matter whether the individuals on these lists were perfect angels or individuals who had made mistakes, none of them deserved to die in an episode of vigilante or random justice. So, to answer a hypothetical question, no, I haven't vetted the names that I'm reading because not a single person on this list deserved to go in the way that they did. I remember talking to a woman who's become a friend in Hartford, Connecticut. She lost her son just about a month before Sandy Hook. She remembers when Sandy Hook happened that she latched on to the number of children who were killed. 20 kids were killed that day in Sandy Hook. I asked Senator Bennett, were there survivors from the shooting in the supermarket in Boulder? And he said he had to check, and I will check as well, but he wasn't sure that there were individuals who were seriously injured. And if that is the case, there's parallels to Sandy Hook. The weapons that are being used in these crimes are so lethal, so powerful, that increasingly it's hard to survive wounds when a bullet enters your body at the speed that bullets are traveling when they come from an AR-15 or AR-15 style weapon as was used in Sandy Hook. In Sandy Hook, 20 kids were shot. All 20 of them died. The number 20 was meaningful to my friend because her son was 20 years old when he was killed on October 20th of 2012, the year of Sandy Hook. He was killed by a 20-year-old, and he was the 20th victim of gun violence that year in Hartford, Connecticut. She told this story about what her life was like after her son was killed, after Shane was killed. She said first, she just didn't want to leave the house ever. She didn't want to see anybody. She would always walk down the street to the corner bodega to pick up groceries, but you think it was only a block or so away. She came to driving there so that there was no chance that she'd have to meet people she knew along the way. Her life became fundamentally different, right? Her life ended, as she described it, in so many ways when her only son disappeared from the earth. And she talked about this strange habit that came to dominate some of her evenings. She would get up in the middle of the night, and she would get in her car, and she'd drive to the site where Shane was shot. Shane was shot about 2 blocks from my house where I live in Hartford, Connecticut. I drive by the site of Shane's shooting almost every day when I am going back to our home. She'd drive to that site, she'd stop her car, and she'd turn on her high beams as if she was waiting for Shane to show up, as if she was waiting for him to come back. She knew he never was, but this became a habit. It just speaks to this immense, incalculable trauma that families go through when they lose a loved one, a trauma that you can't truly understand. In Sandy Hook, one mother adopted another curious but understandable habit in the years after Sandy Hook. She would, during an afternoon on a Saturday or Sunday, convince herself that her son, who had been killed in Sandy Hook, was at a friend's house. She'd sort of create this fantasy, this fiction in her mind. And she'd find it a little bit easier to go about cleaning up the house or doing laundry or playing with her other children if in her mind she could pretend just for a half an hour or an hour that her son was safe at a friend's house. And she was successful in contorting her mind to give her that space for that short period of time. But it's what she needed to do, something that you never, ever want to have to contemplate. Creating these fictions in your mind to allow you to survive just for an hour at a time, shining bright lights on an empty space near downtown Hartford, thinking maybe that your son will show up. These are contortions of action and thinking that nobody should have to deal with. Rashawn Tate from California, Shauna Lynn Williams from North Carolina, Stanley Taylor from Missouri, Tyrese Thomas from Mississippi, Tyrone Brown from Ohio, Tyrone Gregory from Ohio, Anthony Collins from Georgia, Anthony Millian from Indiana, Antoine Jamil Johnson from Missouri, Brad Rumfeld from Texas, Brittany Dawn Scruggs from Texas, Brian Fundura, Kentucky, Carlessa Taylor, Michigan, Curtin Smith, Oregon, Davion Pullum, Indiana, Datrio Deshawn Wharton, Alabama, Enel Ray Collier Rubenstall, North Carolina, James Del Giorno, Florida, Jessica Morehouse, Missouri, Jordan Reen, New York, Joseph Marwin Brown, Michigan, Jovan Hallman, California, Kevin Neal, Georgia, Kimberly Markham, Ohio, Latavius Cortez Hall, Louisiana, Leon Kellum, Delaware, Lavelle Larimore, New Jersey, Luis Rafael Lopez, Arizona, Michael Vines, Michigan. I apologize if I'm mispronouncing some of these names. I'm seeing many of them for the first time. But it's important for us to read these names into the record so that at least they live in that space. Because the numbers aren't moving our colleagues to action. So far this year, just 2021, there have been 9,649 gun-related deaths. Now, these include homicides and murders, accidental shootings, and suicides. Some people take issue with the fact that when we talk about the gun violence epidemic, that we're including suicides in these numbers, and there have been thousands of suicides in the United States this year. But it's important that we talk about these deaths together. Again, this evening is not going to be a time to go deep into the question of policy change, but when you do start to explore interventions and causes, you will find that many of the same causes for homicides cause suicides as well. For instance, there's a very clear correlation between poverty and gun homicide. There is a very clear correlation between poverty and your risk of suicide. There is a clear correlation between the ease of access to a firearm and homicide as there is to suicide. In states that have universal background checks, there are generally lower rates of homicide. There are also generally lower rates of suicide as well. So we talk about suicides together. Now, people are paying attention today to this epidemic because of what has happened in Atlanta and what has happened in Colorado. And I understand why we pay more attention to mass shootings. There is something unique and frightening about large-scale, indiscriminate slaughter. But mass shootings are just not those incidences where 10 people die. There are mass shootings where 3 or 4 people are shot. That's still a significant crime. And so far this year, there have been 104 of those. There's been 104 mass shootings this year. You didn't know that, right? You thought there was just Atlanta and Boulder. No, not true. There's been 104 mass shootings. And I believe most times mass shootings are defined as when 4 or more people are shot at the same time. Not necessarily killed, but shot. There have been 104 mass shootings just this year. 191 deaths and injuries of children aged 11 and younger. Think about that. In this year alone, almost 200 kids aged 11 and younger have been killed. 128 deaths of teenagers, 108 deaths and injuries of teenagers aged 12 to 17. In May 2020, think about this, there were 61 mass shootings. Now, in May 2020, we were mostly focused on the pandemic. We were focused on trying to get people well. The country was not talking about gun violence in the way it normally would if there were 61 mass shootings in 1 month. That's the highest monthly total ever tallied by the Gun Violence Archive, which is a nonprofit research group where a lot of our data and names come from. They began tracking data in 2013. But since they've been tracking the data, May 2020 was the highest number of mass shootings, but you didn't hear about it because most of those mass shootings were 4 or 5 or 6 people, not 20 or 30 or 40. And honestly, many of those mass shootings were likely people of color, which don't get as much attention either. Mushab Muhammad Ali from Minnesota, Rasan Mack, Illinois, Rokobi Rogers, Missouri, Roxanne Martinez, Colorado, Samuel Lee Pollard, Mississippi, Steve Alfonso, North Carolina, Terrence Armour, Michigan, Timothy Swope, Illinois, Wendy Lee Higgins, Florida, Xavier Frost, Oklahoma, Anne Marie Winters Wilson, Georgia, Audrey Isham, Indiana, Cameron Watkins, Virginia. I'm not even close, Mr. President, to the 9,649 gun-related deaths in 2021 alone. I'm glad to be joined on the floor by my colleague, Senator Klobuchar, who I'll yield to in a moment. I want to thank her for being a real steadfast partner in these efforts, and in particular focusing, as she has, on the crime of domestic violence. Senator Klobuchar, earlier this evening, I was describing a murder in New Haven, Connecticut, that happened on the same day as Colorado, in which a young woman was sitting in a car with her boyfriend, with her 1-year-old in the back seat. They were in an argument. She was trying to leave him, and she shot him in the car with the child in the back seat. And I was talking about how little attention that got in Connecticut, never mind the country, how we pay attention to these mass shootings for good reason, but how every one of these individuals has a story attached to them. She was someone her friends relied on for counsel, for moral support, and how that death initiates so many other traumas. And I was honored to be able to read her name into the record tonight, one of many who will now find their names on the congressional record, so that, at the very least, the record of our proceedings will remember her life and think about what could have been had we not been so cavalier with her life and her safety through our inaction. I yield the floor.
President.
Senator from Minnesota.
Thank you so much, Senator Murphy, for those beautiful words. And, when you honor the victims, as you should, you honor all victims. And what I've found about these crimes, particularly the crime of domestic violence, is so often the victims have been hidden from view. It's a crime that takes place in someone's bedroom with the door closed. It's a crime that takes place in a house that no one ever sees. And as you know, in that situation like this, when there's a gun, it becomes deadly. And one of my memories when years ago, a police officer in a small town in Minnesota responded to a domestic violence call. And what a lot of people don't know is that oftentimes those are the most dangerous calls police officers take. And it was a victim who had called the police, very young, and it was someone who had severe mental illness problems, her boyfriend. And the police went to the door, doors answered, and the guy shot the police officer. And he was wearing a bulletproof vest, but he shot him in the head. And I was at that funeral. And it's a reminder that the crime of domestic violence isn't just about one victim, it's about an entire community. And as the widow walked down the aisle of the church, she had her two little boys with her, and then she was holding this little girl in a dress covered in stars. And the last time that family had been in that church was for the nativity play that the boys were in, and the dad was sitting proudly in the front row, and now they were at his funeral. That's what we're talking about with gun violence. And I join my colleagues on the floor to honor Americans whose lives were cruelly and unjustly taken from us by gun violence. And I'm going to read some names of people that should never be forgotten. In Alabama, Chase Green. In Arizona, Isaias Garcia Tovar, Sr., Isaiah Tovar, Jr., and Delia Noriega. In Connecticut, Dwania Turner. In Delaware, Demir Chambers. In Florida, Ernest Bug Riggs, Jr. In Illinois, Brenda Poss Barnes, Greg Barnes, Sr., and Daniel Kinney. In Indiana, Chanel Neal. In Kentucky, Kenya Renee Cunningham, DeMontre Rhodes, and Catherine Bryan. In Missouri, Johnny Jones. In Ohio, Alonso Lewis. In Tennessee, Kevin Nibisi. In Virginia, Eddie Jenkins. In Wisconsin, Kevin Cloth and Kevin Schneider. Those are just 20 names out of the thousands of people lost to gun violence every year, an average of 100 gun violence deaths each day. That's 3 classrooms of children. We also know the communities where mass shootings occur will never be the same. Atlanta, Georgia, Boulder, Colorado are now part of the ever-growing list of cities and towns forever altered but never forgotten. Midland, Odessa, Dayton, El Paso, Virginia Beach, Pittsburgh, Parkland, Las Vegas, Orlando, Charleston, Newtown, to name a few. And I'm greatly saddened that my home state of Minnesota also has communities on that list. On average, someone is killed with a gun every 21 hours in my state. That is 422 people each year. Tonight, I'm going to focus on the loss of 2 women from Minnesota, both of whom were healthcare workers, and both were moms. For the past year, frontline healthcare workers protected us from the pandemic. But Lindsay Overbay and Bao Yang, we failed to protect them. In February, Lindsay was killed in a horrible shooting at the Allina Health Clinic in Buffalo, Minnesota, where 4 of her coworkers were also injured. This just happened last month. She was a medical assistant at the clinic and devoted her life to healing others. She had a wonderful laugh that would make a room spark to life. Her husband said that her laugh was so distinctive that if you walked into the clinic and you heard her laughing, you knew exactly who it was. The spark of her own life was her family, her husband of 10 years and her beloved children, an 8-year-old boy and a 5-year-old girl. Friends said that she lived and breathed her kids, that she cherished every moment spent with them. Her field of cardiology put her in contact with older patients whom she loved caring for because she said, quote, "They are at an age where they say what they are thinking," end quote. It's gut-wrenching and heartbreaking to think that Lindsay won't get to that age, won't get that happy freedom, won't get to see her 2 children grow up and graduate and have families of their own. It has been reported that the shooter, some described as a disgruntled patient, had previously made threats against the clinic. Although we don't know whether this tragedy could have been prevented, in some way we know it could have been. We should be doing more to encourage states to pass common sense laws and get passed laws right here in this body that allow family members or law enforcement to get a court order to temporarily prevent a person who is in crisis from buying a gun. By the way, Senator Murphy knows this. After Parkland, I was in the White House when Donald Trump was president. I was seated across from him. I was seated next to former Vice President Pence, and I was there because of the domestic violence bill that I lead. And I still have the piece of paper where I wrote the hashtags down on a piece of paper when Donald Trump said that he was for universal background checks, not once, not twice, not 3 times, multiple times. And when we talked about this very issue, the idea of getting a court order to temporarily prevent a person who is in crisis from buying a gun, something that Vice President Pence supported because of what had happened in Indiana, and they had a similar law, President Trump said he was for it, that he was for this stuff. And then what happens? And we all know this. The next day, 2 days later, after this meeting that we had that was on TV, he met with the NRA, and he backed down. We can't keep backing down, and we know we now have a president in Joe Biden that will not back down. So here's another story. Just days ago, we lost another mother of 2, Ms. Bao Yang of St. Paul, Minnesota. She worked hard raising her sons, ages 21 and 11, as a single mom. She held multiple jobs while she studied to be a nurse, graduating and getting her license a few years ago. According to her son, all she ever wanted was to raise my little brother in the best life she could give him. I could see how much stress she carried every day, but still always managed to provide for us. Bao's sister said she was a sweet, loving, caring, hardworking person who only wanted the best for everyone. But a few days ago, right around what happened in Atlanta, on Saturday morning, these stories are both completely fresh. They just happened. Saturday morning at 8:30, police were called to her house where they found that she had been shot. She died later that morning. According to her family, she was a victim of domestic violence, turned deadly because of a gun. Her killer was her former boyfriend. Unfortunately, her story is far too common. According to the Department of Justice, nearly half of women killed by intimate partners are killed by current or former dating partners. Violence Free Minnesota, a statewide coalition of organizations that provide services to victims of domestic abuse, said that her homicide she was the 8th Minnesotan to die due to domestic violence this year. There were 29 domestic violence-related deaths in Minnesota last year. And yet federal law does not prohibit abusive dating partners or convicted stalkers from buying a gun, which is the problem I've been trying to fix since I got to Washington. We had hearings on this bill. We had a hearing in the Judiciary Committee years ago where the Republican witnesses agreed that we should close what's called the boyfriend loophole. As one of the conservative sheriffs that testified from Wisconsin said, he said that basically mean boyfriends shoot just as hard and hit just as hard as mean husbands. But yet, that discrepancy exists in a number of states. And what just happened just a few weeks ago? The Violence Against Women Act passed in the House of Representatives, Senator Murphy. It passed in the House of Representatives with 29 Republican votes, and that provision is in there. That is now coming over to the U.S. Senate, and it's been one of the reasons this bill has been stalled out. I do not know how, after what we have seen with the numbers of domestic violence cases, after the story I just told of a woman we just lost this weekend, how, after what happened in Atlanta, we cannot acknowledge this violence against women, in particular against women of color. So this is one thing that we can do right now. We literally can pass that bill as we work on background checks and all of the other things that we need to do. And I will end with this, since Senator Murphy, what happened in his state with the Sandy Hook shooting was forever etched on all of our minds and memories. It still goes down for me when people say, what's your best day in the Senate? I talk about a bill I passed of maybe little note to some involving a young girl that was killed as a result of a swimming pool tragedy. And we fixed that rule about pools, and at least a few years ago, no one had died since. And then they asked what the saddest day. For me, the saddest day is when the background check, the bipartisan background check went down, because those parents that Senator Murphy knows so well were in my office, and I was one of the several senators that had to tell them that no, even though they had the courage to come before the Senate, in particular, one woman who told me that story of waiting in the firehouse, waiting as one by one the kids would come in, and pretty soon they knew that they would never see their little boy again. And now she just broke down crying, remembering the last thing she'd seen him do, which was point to the picture of the school aide on their refrigerator. And as she sat there, crumpled on the floor, crying, she thought of that aide and thought, she'll never leave his side. And when they found him shot in the school, that woman had her arms around that little boy, and they were both shot to death. And we all had to look at those families and say, you had the courage to come forth to fight for a bill that wouldn't have even prevented the killing of your children, but you knew it was the best thing to prevent violence around the country, and that was background checks. But the Senate did not have the courage to pass it. That time has come. The courage must be in all of us, and we must get this done. Thank you, Senator Murphy. Mr. President, I yield the floor.
Mr. President.
Senator from Pennsylvania.
Mr. President, I rise as my colleagues have tonight to talk about gun violence again. It seems that only a few months passes when we're here over and over again talking about this uniquely American problem. Tonight we gather in grief, a lot of sadness throughout the country, people offering, as I do tonight, once again, condolences to the families in both the state of Georgia, the state of Colorado, and so many others, so many other families throughout the country who've lost a loved one just in the last week or month or within the last year. But we also, I think, tonight have to do more than just offer condolences and offer support for the families. We have to ask ourselves some basic questions. And one question that keeps coming back every time we gather, at least for me it does, and I know probably for a lot of Americans, is not simply why are we not beginning to solve this problem? Why aren't we taking action? There are obvious questions we all ask. But one question that keeps coming to me over and over again is a simple question about the United States Senate. Will the United States Senate, once again, as it has now, we can say year after year, will the United States Senate surrender to gun violence? That's a question I've been asking myself. I think I've certainly asked it on this floor. Will the Senate continue to surrender to gun violence? And by extension, therefore, the country is not taking action when we don't take action. The only way that we can begin to solve this problem over time is to take action here in the Senate. The House has acted over and over again, as we know, bill after bill. In a larger sense, we have to ask ourselves, is it really true? Will it be true again that the most powerful nation on earth, really the most powerful nation in the history of the human race, will that nation once again surrender to this problem because of inaction here? I know this is true in every state in the Union, but I certainly know it's true in Pennsylvania. The people of my home state and the people of America expect us to act. They don't expect us to surrender once again to this problem. They expect us to take action to pass common sense gun measures that will, at a minimum, reduce the likelihood that we'll have more mass shootings like we've experienced just in the last week, and over again over months and now years. And even now we're moving into decades of mass casualty events involving guns. So they expect us to act, not to genuflect to the gun lobby. And tonight we have to ask that question again. Will the United States Senate surrender to this problem, and really by implication surrender and genuflect to the gun lobby? Tonight I know that my colleague from Connecticut, Senator Murphy, and others have read through some names of victims of gun violence. And I'll add to that list. It's about 20, just a fraction, a tiny fraction of those we lost just in the last couple of years from so many different states. Cortland Williams from the state of Missouri, Marcus O'Brien Young from the state of North Carolina, Marquez Warden from Virginia, Marvin Scott from Maryland, Melvin Porter from Georgia, Omar Muhammad Juma from Texas, Russell Jones, also from Texas, Sevian Themarcus Washington from the state of Alabama, Angela Thomas from Oklahoma, Stephanie Lee from Ohio, Tajir LaFleur from California, Tian Burwell from Virginia, Xavier Cantor from South Carolina, Brenda Sue Strasser Sines, Maryland, Terralyn Cantrell from Arkansas, Tashandra Fortune from Mississippi, Quindarius Ford from Georgia, Raymel Richardson from Louisiana, Sarah LaRocca from Colorado, and finally, Andre Odom from Ohio. I'm not sure it's possible for any one of us whose family has not been a victim of gun violence to in any way not only understand, but even to offer the appropriate words that we try to offer to these families on a night like this and on so many other days and nights. I always turn back to the words of others about what this might mean to those families. I just can't even imagine what it would be like to lose a family member to gun violence, or to any violence for that matter. Remember the words of the great recording artist Bruce Springsteen. He wrote a song in the aftermath, the horror of the aftermath of 9/11, and he was trying to capture in a series of songs that he wrote and put in an album at the time, capturing the loss, the pain of the loss that so many American families felt at that time. And I always thought it was applicable, that kind of loss, to what these families feel when a member of their family is killed by gun violence. Springsteen's refrain in that song, the name of the song is "You're Missing." And he keeps using that refrain. You're missing when I shut out the lights. You're missing when I close my eyes. You're missing when I see the sunrise. That's the reality for these families. Every moment of their day will be a time when they will be missing that family member, for God only knows how long. So we're thinking of those families tonight who have loved and lost. We're also remembering, and this is another area where we have not taken action, we're also remembering families that had a member of their family become a victim of gun violence, but they survived. But their life has changed unalterably. The life of that individual has changed. The life of his or her family changes. And so many burdens they have to carry having survived gun violence. We know that 100 are killed each day, more than 40,000 across the country in our country. But we also know numbers about those who have survived. 230 people sustain a non-fatal gun injury every day. It's estimated that about 10 million Americans have been shot and injured during their lifetime. 10 million Americans. We also know that gun violence injuries are more likely to occur in younger people. Each year, approximately 15,600 children and teenagers are shot and injured. Black children and teenagers are 14 times more likely than their white peers to die by gun homicide. Those who survive, those huge numbers who survive, have their lives changed forever. The role that that victim plays in the family is made exponentially more difficult. I'll talk about one of those individuals tonight. His name is Asir Harris. Asir Harris was 17 years old in February of 2018, February the 15th to be exact. It was the day after the Parkland shooting in Florida. Asir was shot 5 times on his way to grab something to eat with 2 of his friends in South Philadelphia. He was paralyzed from the waist down, struck in the crossfire of gun violence as an innocent bystander. Asir's life and his family's life was turned upside down in seconds. Their house was just blocks away from where he almost lost his life. Again, as I said, shot 5 times. To navigate their 2-story home, Asir's father would carry him up and down the stairs in their home. They searched desperately to relocate, but were having trouble finding housing, which is often nearly impossible for victims of gun violence. The family was eventually able to relocate into a home in North Philadelphia, but in the process they were forced to leave behind some of their adult children in the old home they came from. Asir continues to learn about how to navigate his new life in a wheelchair, and the family continues to struggle to find ways to improve his quality of life. Now they're searching for housing outside of the city so they might be able to find a home with a backyard for Asir to enjoy. Asir and his family will never be able to forget about this shooting when he was shot 5 times, because they live with the consequences of that violence every single day. They're just one of millions who struggle financially, who struggle physically, who struggle emotionally because of the trauma of gun violence that has ravaged our communities, our schools, our churches, and our businesses. So the United States Senate has an obligation on this part of the problem as well. We can't surrender to gun violence, and we can't surrender to the question of what we're going to do to help those who survive. We certainly have to pass common sense gun measures, as I mentioned before. Something as simple and as overwhelmingly popular as universal background checks. And at the same time, we can pass a number of other common sense measures, including a bill that I'm leading with here in the Senate and paired up with United States Representative Dwight Evans in the House, a great leader in our state from the city of Philadelphia. This bill is the Resources for Victims of Gun Violence, and Dwight Evans and I are working to get it passed. The bill would create an interagency advisory council with experts from federal agencies, victims of gun violence, and victim assistance professionals. Among other things, this council would make it easier for victims of gun violence to access resources by assessing, gathering, and disseminating information about different benefits and programs that could assist the victims of gun violence, like Asir and his family. But I come back to where I started as I conclude my remarks, Mr. President. We have to ask that question: will the United States Senate once again surrender to gun violence? Do nothing about the tragic loss of life that we've seen just in the last week. Surrender to the carnage that we see, not just this week and last week, and month after month, but now literally decade after decade. There hasn't been on the floor of the United States Senate a significant, substantial debate on gun violence in I don't know how long, I guess since maybe 2013. 8 years. 8 years of virtually no debate, and 8 years of not voting, not even casting a vote on these common sense gun measures, because the gun lobby has created a blockade. So the Senate was not even permitted, I guess, under their rules, the rules of the gun lobby and the rules of the majority until most recently, prohibited from even debating, let alone voting on common sense measures. So while the victims of gun violence are burdened by all the changes in their lives and the expense and the trauma they live through, while others suffer through the consequence of losing a loved one and feel that sense of missing someone every day, while all that's happening, the United States Senate is frozen in place for 8 years at least, where we haven't even voted on common sense measures. It's time for the United States Senate to act, not to genuflect to the gun lobby, like so many in this chamber seem to want to do year after year. It's time for the Senate to act and to pass common sense gun reform at long last. I yield the floor.
Mr. President,
Senator from Connecticut.
I want to thank Senator Casey for his very powerful remarks and all of my colleagues for coming to the floor tonight in this event that Senator Murphy and I are helping to lead, and now recognize Senator Van Hollen of Maryland, a great friend and colleague who knows a lot about this topic.
Mr. President.
Senator from Maryland.
Thank you, Mr. President. I want to thank Senator Blumenthal, Senator Murphy, everybody who's been brought together by this tragedy that we've witnessed in our country. First a few days ago in Atlanta, then Boulder. And the tragedy is these are not isolated events. These are the kind of tragedies that we see all too often, and indeed every day, in neighborhoods and streets around our country. So it's important that we come together to talk about the horror of the daily toll of gun violence, and also highlight the horror of the fact that this body and the federal government have not taken action to stop those daily horrors. Mr. President, I want to begin by joining my colleagues in reading out loud the names of 20 of our fellow Americans who have perished from gun violence just this year. 15 from across the country, and 5 from my home state of Maryland. This is this year, and this is just a few of those who've been shut down and shot down through gun violence. Caleb Day of Ohio, age 19. Cody Nichols Campbell of Indiana, age 27. Alex Jackson of New Mexico, age 15. Gregory Dwayne Lynn of Texas, age 32. Deborah Derrick of New Jersey, age 63. Jason B. West of North Carolina, age 36. Jeremiah Lowry of Louisiana, age 17. Caleb Martin of South Carolina, age 18. Levante Sharon Johnson of Virginia, age 23. Holly Elizabeth Beard of Montana, Alabama, March 11th, 21, age 51. Jessica Ruiz of Texas, age 20. Najibat Sewell of Pennsylvania, age 24. Ricardo M. Lopez of New York, age 37. Richard Douglas Sloan of Kentucky, age 33. Tyree Riley of Indiana, age 18. And in Maryland, in my state of Maryland, just this year, April Renee Lawson, age 18. Genesis Garrett, age 22. Terry Williams, age 18. Gann Gersley, age 50. Guy Thomas, age 52. Mr. President, we read these names tonight and remember these lives because it is important to pay tribute to those who we've lost, but it is also to make sure that tonight is not the end of their story and that we dedicate ourselves to turning words into action here in the United States Senate. Our country's now experiencing an upswing in gun violence, the largest increase in gun violence since 1960. Between the years 2019 and 2020, we've seen that big jump. And it should horrify everyone and give us pause and cause us to reflect. Mr. President, I've been texting back and forth in the last few days after the shootings in Atlanta and Boulder with a friend of mine that I first met 2 decades ago. Her name is Carol Price, and I met her under the most tragic of circumstances. Carol and her husband, John, lost their beloved 13-year-old son, John, to gun violence. Their beautiful 13-year-old boy, John, went next door to play at a neighbor's house. There was a loose gun, and it was an accidental shooting. John died. He was 13 years old. Like so many other parents or loved ones of victims of shooting deaths, Carol had the courage to take her pain, take her tragedy, and work to try to make sure that that kind of pain and tragedy didn't happen to another family in the state of Maryland or in the country. But she did what was within her power. At the time, I was in the Maryland legislature, and she came and implored the Maryland legislature to do something, just something, to prevent this kind of horrible tragedy from being experienced by other Maryland families. And the legislature acted. Maryland became the first state in the country at that time to require that guns sold in our state have embedded trigger locks, safety locks, so that if they were left lying around, it'd be less likely that some 13-year-old boy or girl would pick it up and shoot their friend. And that bill saved lives in Maryland. That's because of Carol Price. And you think of what's happening today in our country. The pandemic hit. What did we do? We worked to follow the advice of public health experts, social distance, wear masks, and we went into overdrive to develop a vaccine to stop the deaths. So when it comes to the epidemic of gun violence, we see no such actions being taken here at the federal level. The normal thing to do would be to do what the Maryland State Legislature did in response to that tragedy that Carol Price brought, to try to take some action to prevent other families from experiencing that tragedy. And when Carol texted me the other day, it was just another reminder that the pain of losing a loved one to gun violence never goes away. And in fact, that pain comes back again and again when we see these mass shootings. And it comes back again and again when Carol Price reads about another boy or girl or other person who's died from gun violence in Maryland. Again, we see it on a daily basis. And the reason it's so important that we come together and focus on this is that there are some, I think, in our country who've lost the capacity to be surprised. I know we were all shocked and surprised after Columbine, after Sandy Hook, after the Pulse nightclub, and then the Mother Emanuel AME shooting, maybe the shooting in Las Vegas. We were shocked at some point in the past that people would indiscriminately take the lives of others. We were shocked at the daily toll of gun violence, even if it was in a place like Baltimore, another city in Maryland, that it didn't make the national news. This still was a shocking thing that somebody would just gun down a fellow human being. But now, when we see it happen time and again, mass shootings and the daily toll, nobody can claim surprise. What is surprising is that as a nation, we haven't summoned the will to do something about it, the same way we've worked to summon the will to defeat the coronavirus pandemic. In 2019, 757 Marylanders died from gun violence. In fact, it's become so routine that by this time tomorrow, on the current trajectory, two more Marylanders will have died from gun violence. That's one state out of our 50 states. This is something that tears at the fabric of communities in our country. It has had a disproportionate impact and pain on communities of color. I want to tell my colleagues about Denise Reed, who knows what it's like to carry the burden and pain of losing loved ones to gun violence. Denise grew up in Baltimore. She lost her uncle to gun violence. She lost her cousin to gun violence. She lost her cousin's girlfriend to gun violence. Her mother was shot standing in the doorway of their Baltimore home. Thankfully, she survived. In October 2006, Denise's son, Tavon, was shot and gravely wounded, paralyzed from the neck down. He survived his injury for 3 years, but passed away after that. So tonight, I ask all of us to pay tribute to Denise and her son, Tavon Terrell Water Sr., who's gone too soon. But I want to tell you about Denise, because she is an inspiration to us all. She still lives in Baltimore. She works as the chaplain with the Baltimore City Police, working every day to serve her community and give back to the city she loves but wants to make better and safer. My state of Maryland has thankfully joined Denise and Carol Price and all those who have lost someone to gun violence by passing common sense measures in our state of Maryland. But the state of Maryland, like every other state, is not an island. We can't do it alone. We need for the Congress to take action. If you look at guns that are used in Maryland in crimes, 54% of them come from outside of the state of Maryland, from states that do not have those kind of common sense gun laws that make people safer. And so Maryland, like so many other states, is calling upon our brothers and sisters from across the union to help us take action. And we know that the public believes and understands that too. Some of my colleagues have said 90% of the American public supports basic background checks for people purchasing guns. I want to tell my colleagues about Michael Derrick Bond, who was born March 18th, 1983, excelled in school throughout his life. He went to college in Maryland, then he moved to Delaware. His mother, Cheryl, remembers picking up the phone one day and hearing her son at the other end of the line saying, "Mom, I went to Walmart and got a gun in 15 minutes. I can't get a driver's license that fast, but I got a gun because I'm feeling pain and I have a gun to my head." Cheryl and Michael spoke on the phone for 2 hours before Michael agreed to take the bullets out of his gun. But that wasn't the last time that he made an attempt, and Michael died of suicide, gunshot, February 2014. Mr. President, whether it's the ease of getting a gun to commit suicide or the ease of getting a gun to shoot down others, what we have in the country today is simply unacceptable. As Daniel Webster, who's a public health researcher at Johns Hopkins University in Maryland, has said, gun violence is not inevitable. It's very preventable. We know that. We know there are things we can do to prevent gun violence. Mr. President, I'm not going to go into a litany of legislation that we could pass to make things better. I do want to point out, though, that we have an organization, the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, Firearms, and Explosives, ATF as it's commonly referred to, whose job it is, who's charged with protecting the public from the illegal use and trafficking of firearms. And yet, while we give them that charge, we give them that responsibility, the House and the Senate over the years have tied up their hands. We've handcuffed them. We've made it very difficult for them to do their job. We prevent them from sharing trace crime data on firearms with the public and on people doing research into the gun violence epidemic. We bar the ATF from legally requiring gun dealers to keep accurate inventories of their guns and report lost or stolen firearms. Simple things like that we say they can't do. Mr. President, I want to end by talking about an initiative of the mayor of Baltimore City, Mayor Brandon Scott, who's worked with Everytown, the organization, to create a cutting-edge internal system to help law enforcement track and understand and disrupt the stream of firearms entering the city of Baltimore. And they've worked hard to try to overcome these obstacles that we put in the way of ATF. But that's a challenge, and it shouldn't be so hard. We had a program in the city of Baltimore, still do. It's called Safe Streets. It's headed by a person called Dante Barksdale. He went by the name of Tatter, known throughout Baltimore as the smiling face of Safe Streets, which was a gun violence prevention program. Dante was committed to the mission. He helped others learn to put down their guns. Dante was shot to death on January 17th of this year. In that moment, Maryland lost a son, a mentor, a hero, as Mayor Scott called him, a man who saved thousands of lives in our city, thousands of lives. And yet his was taken by gun violence. gun violence that's preventable. Mr. President, I yield the floor.
Senator from New Jersey.
Member after member has come down tonight to speak. And the conversations, as we all have come down here, was to come do something that I think is extraordinarily poignant. This is a floor where policy is debated, where ideas of governance are discussed. It is the deliberative body. But we are in a democracy, and we represent people. And so tonight, the idea was that we would come down here and talk about people, but the pain is that they are not alive. That we would discuss the deceased, the dead, the murdered, the killed. I believe that if America has not broken your heart, then you don't love her enough. Name after name tonight has been spoken by colleague after colleague, and dear God, every single name is a son or daughter. It is a brother or sister. It is a family member. They are a person, part of a community, and they are dead. But this is not just any limited list. It seems to grow like a cancer on the soul of our country. You take my age, 51 years old. Well, in just the time of my life, the death in our country has been something like has never before been seen in even a country at war, because the people that have died, the human beings that have lost, the family members that have been slain, their total number in just my lifetime add up to more than all of the Americans that have died in every single war, from the Revolution to our current wars in the Middle East. And so my friends and my colleagues have read name after name after name, but the painful, heartbreaking reality is we could have taken hour after hour over days after days to name the total that have died in my lifetime. And the heartbreak, the stories, they have to stagger you when you hear the testimony. On March 1st, Caden Alex Peak, who was 4 years old, and his brother Mason Paul Peak, who was 3 years old, were gunned down, killed in Warsaw, Missouri. Jennifer Garcia, 21 years of age. Charlie Bourbon Lopez, 20 years, killed in Portland, Oregon. Say their names, say their names, say their names. Kobe Hilliard, 19, killed in Temple, Texas. April Williams, 21. Her mom, Tammy Briggs, 46, killed in Georgia, in Augusta. Say their names. Say their names. Christine Ruffin, age 61, killed with a gun in Palm City, Florida. Delquan Daniels, 23 years old, killed with a gun in Rochester, New York. Say their names. Say their names. Jerson Alaman Vasquez, 19, killed with a gun in Myrtle Beach, South Carolina. Lionel Darling, age 39. Renisha Dotson, age 30, killed with guns. Killed with guns. Say their name. Say their name. Maritza Paniagua, age 20, killed with a gun in Los Angeles. Marlon McAllister, age 51, killed with a gun in Chicago. Mashaila Marie Meredith, 19, killed with a gun in El Dorado, Illinois. Victor Booker, age 20, killed with a gun in Phoenix, Arizona. Ronald Jeffrey Leroy Jones Jr., age 25, killed with a gun in Columbus, Ohio. Say their names. Say their names. This is the question of our country. What is the quality of our mercy? How courageous is our empathy? How destitute is our compassion? How anemic is our love for one another that this many Americans are dying hour after hour, day after day, month after month, year after year, the carnage in our country like never before seen in humanity. And we do nothing as a society in a government that was formed for a more perfect union, for domestic tranquility, for justice. At the top of our federal government's constitution is the very ideal that we are for the common defense. Say their names. Do we honor them? Do we love their survivors? Love is not sentimentality, it's not words. It demands something, it necessitates sacrifice. And I can't tell you, I am one of those folks who, serving in the mayor of an American city, would have my police officers show me the films of murders from our cameras, human beings being shot and killed. How could it not shake the core of your soul? How could it not rip open wounds that cannot be healed? My colleagues reading names of people, children lost, kids lost to suicide, bodies mangled, people paralyzed. How could it not call to your conscience? How can it not demand from all of us not to sit idly by and watch and witness? We are wounded as a society. We are hurting. There is pain that is unspoken, and that is so dangerous. In 2018, Shahad Smith, I knew him well. I used to live in high-rise projects at the top of my block. There was a group of boys there led by this young man named Hassan Washington. Hassan was brilliant. He was funny. He had a sharp wit. He had charisma. Shahad was one of the young men in high school that hung out with him. In the lobby of my buildings, I would come home and I would see them there. And I'll tell you, in 2018, I make it to the United States Senate, and I get a call from Jimmy Wright, police officer from those buildings who, it's a beautiful man, and he was shaken. They killed Shahad on my block where I live as a United States Senator, at the top of my block. And I'll never forget how Jimmy described it. He says, Corey, I talked to the police officer who was killed with an assault rifle, and he said, Corey, the police officer told me his head exploded. And I had to hold on to something. Because most of that kids from that lobby, the children I watched grow up in my 8 years living in those projects, in those buildings. Black boys in a world where there's so much assault. The first of them to die. In 2005, I would come home at night. I was chasing my dream to be the mayor of the largest city in my state. I was getting ready to run for office, and I came home and I smelled marijuana in the lobby. Now, we live in a country where it's a lot different, watching kids at Stanford or Yale smoke pot and have no worries. But for inner city black kids, I'll tell you right now, they have no margins for experimentation. And I said to myself, oh, I got to intervene here. So I started asking them, let's get out of this lobby. Let's go do something. Let's go to movies. Let's eat. And I'll never forget, I made a mistake, y'all. I said, you guys choose a movie. That was a mistake because they took me to something called Saw 2. Do not see that movie. And we went out to dinner, diners, Andrew's Diner. I remember the conversations with them. I asked them what their dreams were, and this moved me because their dreams, they were humble dreams. And I said that I would connect them with mentors, and I had all these plans about how to help these young men get out of the danger zone. And then I got too busy with my campaign. And I remember feeling a little guilty that I was too busy to follow through on the commitments I had made, and I consoled myself that I was running for mayor, and when I become mayor, God, I'll be able to help all children in the city. I'll step up then. Let me just get through this campaign. Well, I would still come home at night, and the boys weren't mad at me or anything like that. They would still greet me and cheer me on when I came into the lobby. Shahad and Hassan, it was amazing. They would lift me up. One day they had lawn signs, my lawn signs, waving them, and it formed a parade line, and I walked down waving them, got in the elevator until I realized, where'd they get those lawn signs from? They're kind of expensive. I ended up winning. And I had death threats on me. And when you're elected office, death threats, you have security. And next thing you know, I have police officers stationed in the lobby. And the boys weren't there anymore. They didn't want to hang out where the police officers were. And I didn't think too much about it because I was running at full speed as a new mayor. 36, 37 years old, the violent crime in our city was peaking. There were too many shooters in that hot summer. I will never forget. And I would run to every street corner I could where there was a shooting in our city, and I would stand there and I would say, this is not who we are. This is not America. This is not Newark. We're going to overcome this. And I would give street-level sermons telling people about the vision for a city, and God, we would eventually turn down the violence. But in those early days, a month into my office, I show up on a street corner. There is a body covered by a sheet and another one being loaded on the back of an ambulance. And I barely paid attention to the humanity on the street. I didn't even ask for the names. I was too busy ministering to the living. I get home that night to steal a couple hours of sleep in my early days as mayor, and I'll never forget sitting in my bedroom with my BlackBerry, going through it, and I saw the name on the homicide report. In that moment in my life, something broke in me that we'll never fix. It wasn't an anonymous name that I didn't know. It wasn't just a cold issuance of another crime in a big city. The name was Hassan Washington. 4 floors below me, he lived with his grandma. Kid I promised to help with his dreams. I will never forget his funeral for as long as I live. Perry's Funeral Home, God bless them, those professionals. I entered that funeral home as the newly minted mayor, and I was so upset when I saw it was in their basement room, because going into that room was like descending into the bowel of a ship, a narrow staircase. And I get into this room, we were piled in on top of each other like we were chained together in grief, and people were crying. Everybody was showing up Everybody was there for what is an American tradition. Almost every day, another boy, another black boy in a box, killed by a gun. And I wish I could tell you, Mr. President, that I was strong in that moment. I wish I could tell you I was mayoral, that I was the leader, the father of the city, but I wasn't. I felt shame. I felt hurt. I felt embarrassment. I tried to lean on other people in that room. There were folk I had known for years, but finally I had enough. I had to run. I left there. I jumped in my SUV, drove to my new office in City Hall, and for the first time, not the last, but the first time as mayor of New Jersey's great and largest city, I sat in that office and I wept over a dead boy. And all I could think about was climbing through the feelings of shame and hurt and pain. All I could think about was that funeral, that basement room, packed full of people. All of us were there for his death. But where were we for his life? What a morbid thing we've been doing here tonight. Reading the names of dead people killed in our country. Hoping that somehow we can change. Well, I will tell you this right now. We are in a distraught moment in our nation, where most of us agree on solid steps. It won't solve all the problems, but it would make a difference. It would save a Hassan, it would save a Shahad, it would save the 3- and 4-year-olds I've read. The question is, how courageous are we? How much do we truly love one another? What will we do? This is a moment in American history that could be the inflection point. If we act now, we can end some of this nightmare. If we fail to do anything, we'll be back here again. The list of the dead will be longer. The heartache and the pain and the wounds and the grief and the sorrow and the shame will be deeper in America, the world's greatest country. We must demand of each other a greater love. We must end the poverty of empathy. We must free ourselves from this prison, from this dungeon. We must release ourselves from these chains. We must demand that this nation be the nation we want it to be the nation we hope we should be the nation that those in military uniforms died for. A nation where we make real the greatest principles of humanity, the greatest calling of every faith that there is, not words, but real, true manifestation of the principle and the call. Will we be silent? Will we be ignorant? Will we avoid? Will we do nothing? Will we be passive? Or will we truly be a nation that loves one another? I yield the floor.
Mr. President.
Senator from Connecticut.
Marcia Reitman Curry from New York. Mitchell Wright Jr. from Missouri. Nicholas Tarpley from Pennsylvania. Reuben Lewis III, California. Rice Wingate Bay, Maryland. Robert Crozier, Massachusetts. Samuel Lamont Smith Williams, Tennessee. Spencer Wilcox, Oregon. Anthony Castillo, New York. Mr. President, we didn't come close to finishing this list tonight. We didn't make a dent in the list of those names of the people who have died from gun violence in 2020. 2021 alone, a year in which almost 10,000 people have died in less than 3 months from suicides and homicides and accidental shootings. It's a choice. None of this is inevitable. Almost all of it is preventable. It only happens here in the United States of America because other countries make different choices. Congress goes for the next 2 weeks on a district work period. We wanted to come to the floor tonight to make clear that we are not going to forget those who have died through the inaction of this body, their national leaders, that we're going to renew our commitment to be better and to change and to begin that process in the wake of the shootings in Boulder and Atlanta by making sure that everybody hears the names of those who have died. I yield to Senator Blumenthal to wrap up for the evening.
Mr. President,
Senator from Connecticut.
there is no last word tonight. There is no final saying here. There are no final names. Noah Beller, Tito Roman, Ayala Eubanks, Dominic Boston, Brad Kale, James Ray. We could be here a long time. But the tragedy is there will be more names, 100 more at this time tomorrow night. And every one of these names is a future cut short. Every one of them is a life that could have given so much, bringing more light and joy, pride, grace, dignity. My colleagues have come to the floor with great eloquence, and I want to thank them, but the most eloquent part of tonight are the names. And we should take inspiration from the courage of their families, the strength of survivors, the advocates and activists who are forming a political movement that is creating ripples, turning into waves that will overcome. They will overcome the intransigence and cowardice of colleagues who failed to heed the American public. And they will be held accountable. Thank you, Mr. President. I yield the floor. This is a quorum.
Clerk, call the roll.
Ms. Baldwin.